Hi, Sarah Childers back with you, and today I want to talk about Robert Siodmak's 1946 film, The Spiral Staircase, which in its first 2 or so minutes seems to lay out, in my humble opinion, an almost perfect visual manifesto for territory that's later taken up by filmmakers such as Alfred Hitchcock, Michael Powell, John Carpenter, and Bob Clark. So one of the many cool things about the Spiral Staircase is how it entwines multiple genres, most notably film noir, melodrama, and horror. So we have in this 2-minute scene, you'll see the expressionism and the dark forces that film noir takes up. You'll also see a focus on the female perspective and female suffering that melodrama tends to take as its subject matter, and the anxieties and metafilm dynamics that horror seems to love to play with. So I'm going to first run the scene, and then I'll take you step by step through the scene. Where do we begin? We begin with a specific instance of voyeurism. We see two children and then an adult who actually shoved aside one of the children peeking through a curtain. They are looking without being seen, since they're both hidden by their position in space and by the curtain. And this is almost a textbook definition of voyeurism, looking without being seen. The curtains also create a kind of boundary between the theatrical and the non-theatrical space, but also between what we might call sanctioned and unsanctioned looking. And this group is clearly unsanctioned. Then there's this tilt up by what I like to call an autonomous camera. And what I mean by an autonomous camera is a camera that seems to have its own agency and its own perspective. And that perspective is often more knowledgeable than that of the other characters, or that of the characters, I should say. And that knowledge allows it to make connections that it can then reveal to us as viewers. So we see the camera move up away from the characters. So it's not being motivated by character action. It's actually being motivated by what we might call its own interest. And this movement away from the characters signals that there is another looker involved. There's another looker in the dynamic. We may not be aware that we're a part of that looking dynamic, but there's clearly another gaze at work here. And what it tilts up to look at and linger on is actually a reflection of itself, because what we see is a movie camera looking at a sign announcing a movie. And this provides a meta moment, as well as setting up the intimate nature of what's going to be depicted on screen in the theater before we even see what is being depicted on screen in the theater. So the film is now clearly trading in voyeurism, in the sense of capturing characters who are unseen within their world, who are looking, but also enabling us as unseen viewers to look at characters who are looking and who are unaware that we are looking at them. So it's this kind of mise en abîme of lookers looking at lookers who are looking. We then cut into the theater to a deep focus shot that allows us to see the camera, the audience, and the motion picture in one shot. Notice the couple singled out in the lower right. They seem to be engaging in their own intimate conversation, ignoring the film and its representation of what they're actually realizing. We then cut to the female pianist whose gaze is fixed on the off-screen screen, which signals her visual interest and also switches the gaze from male to female. And then the autonomous camera shows up again as we pan right to a strangely empty chair in the foreground, foreshadowing perhaps, but certainly an efficient way to establish a mystery, a potent absence. In the same shot, though somewhat hard to discern, is our hero Helen, dressed in white and reflecting light in the background. We then cut to her next. Clutching her handkerchief, she's transfixed by the off-screen screen, even bathed in its light. Again, the gaze is female and the object of the gaze is specifically cinematic. I mean, it's cinema writing with light or cinematography writing with light. So she's literally bathed in the light of the cinema. We then get a reverse shot back to the action on screen. We cut back to Helen in medium shot, and she is surrounded by, wait for it, women. Notice that the audience is almost exclusively comprised of women. There are a couple of children. I think there's one young boy, but it's almost an exclusively female audience. We then have the autonomous camera tilting up past the cameraman who's furiously cranking. We then get to the ceiling and the darkened chandelier, and then we dissolve to a woman in medium shot who's walking to a window in her room. We still hear the piano music from below, which is a sound cue that links the two different spaces along with the tilt up and the dissolve. Notice here how the camera crosses the 180-degree line. So we had seen the right side of her face, and now we're seeing the left side of her face. And we see her now in sort of a combination medium shot, medium close-up, as she looks out the window and closes it in response to the thunder sound cue. Then we cut to a medium shot, medium close-up directly behind her. In essence, we've surrounded her, moving from right to left and then behind. And then the camera pans right and tracks her as she moves to the closet, opens it, grabs a nightgown, and then walks out of frame. By not following her, the camera registers her absence, but also seems to set up the potential for a presence, because cinema, like nature, abhors a vacuum. And sure enough, we get that wonderful push in to the close, and we see one of the dresses move slightly, and then we see it move once again, just in case we missed that the first time. Then we have a cut to a close-up, like quite a shocking juxtaposition there. And we cut to the close-up of what ostensibly one might think or assume, but beware of assuming, is a man's eye. And it's beautifully, like, I love this sort of triangular framing of the eye with the clothing. And then the voices on the soundtrack swell in a haunting refrain, which of course reminded me of The Shining, but I guess everything reminds me of The Shining. And then we dissolve into an extreme close-up of the eye. And in fact, I love the way that they've lined it up on this pinpoint of light in the iris. So you move into this from close-up to extreme close-up almost without even really noticing it, but it's pulling us, whether we want to go or not, deeper into the eye, into the field of vision of this hidden voyeur. And then we zoom into the iris. So this montage sequence, as I've already alluded to, brings us back to voyeurism, but a darker, we might say a more noir, maybe melodrama noir, but certainly horror noir version of voyeurism. So we have an unseen looker who is looking at an intimate scene, looking upon someone who has no idea that they're being looked at. But the earlier version of voyeurism that we'd seen downstairs in the theater, which we might almost call a romantic kind of voyeurism or a meta voyeurism or like a G-rated kind of voyeurism, has been replaced by the voyeurism up here, which seems to be almost a more textbook psychological voyeurism of Freud horror and noir, which involves sexual interest in or the habitual practice of watching other people engage in private, intimate behaviors without them knowing that they're actually being looked at. And if we really think about it, this is actually the whole premise of film viewing. We film viewers, unseen in the dark, watch characters engaging in all kinds of private behaviors. We then dissolve to a fisheye view of the woman, a literally warped first-person POV shot. And this is a noir convention that carries over from noir's German expressionist influences. We see as the looker, not just what the looker sees, and we see his, let's just say ostensibly his, distorted and distorting view of the world and of the young woman. We see her put on the nightgown, her face is covered, and we actually don't ever see her face again. So her individual identity, her subjectivity, her individuality has been eradicated in this particular view, in this first person, we might say killer's view. We then cut to a medium close-up of her hands above her head as first one and then the other struggle to free themselves. Then her wrists cross in this kind of like rictus as we hear a gargled sound. And then we, for lack of a better word, smash cut back to the on-screen action in the theater below as the son brings the drowned daughter to the parents. And this reminded me of a quote from Edgar Allan Poe, who once said, "The death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world." Well, that may be true if you're a man, but not so much when you're a woman. So the prominence of women in this scene, the prominence of the female gaze, and also the way we've seen actually two women within 2 minutes die, it really gives us a heightened awareness of female suffering. And so we go from there to a medium close-up of Helen bathed in light. She's kind of slightly gasping as if in horror or maybe even sympathy with the dead young woman on screen. And we could also, because we know a little bit more, it almost seems like she's in commune with the dead young woman up above. And then we see the end. And I love this, the end, and that's why I stopped the clip here, because it's the end of the movie, it's the end of the movie girl and the kiss, and it's also the end of the movie girl and the spiral staircase. We have another kind of interesting mise en abîme in a really definitive way to say, okay, this is the end of the opening sequence, but also a very kind of potent and portentous end. And by doing this, Siodmak basically sets the terms for the rest of the movie and does so all within like 2 minutes or so. Pretty impressive.